Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on futuristic education. We have our world famous speaker, Professor Rob Enderle and Professor David Smith. First, I would like to give chance Professor David Smith. I think Professor Rob taking breakfast. Professor David Smith.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sharif. Futuristic education is a term that has multiple meanings, but let's start with one of them that really looks at how education will be changing as we go forward and what are some of the elements of that. And I really love one of the things that a person over in the United States, Malcolm X, said about education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. And that is really never more true in today with the very rapid increases we see happening in technology and all the other areas around that. And we can see that the pattern of teaching and learning is changing. COVID dramatically affected our view of education and how that impacts. And part of the futuristic education is it's becoming more and more technology process. And you begin to look at technology solutions that across all of the domain and how it's going to work. And we understand that education is to prepare students with skills and knowledge to help make them productive in society and their jobs and others. And it's going to be affected by so many different factors. We see the impacts of COVID, where all of a sudden education and training were totally disrupted from a classroom environment to an online environment. Curriculum that had been used for decades and decades and decades now had to be redone and shifted. We see in technology areas the rapid growth of boot camps, expanding use of short-term educational, which teach explicit skills instead of general knowledge, is becoming more and more popular too. We also understand that the school closures, really globally, and the role of education has never been more critical, more uncertain in how it's going to be. We're seeing as the pandemic subsides, but still very active, the balance of work in education has shifted. We're seeing more and more online capabilities. We're seeing more things like conversational AI-driven bots and avatars and systems being hit there. We're seeing teachers leaving school in unprecedented numbers because they were not prepared to see where education's going. And as we look more on the global scale outside of pure education and training, we see people have looked to connect with each other, to receive information, solutions, share ideas. And how do education change to allow for the exchange of ideas, policy, practices, and others? Technology is changing so fast, it's going to be difficult for people to keep up. And we know that is going to be a big challenge. We see that colleges are bearing the brunt, as well as K through 12 education as well. But we know that a tidal shift change is going through education today, and that we need to make sure we look at the options to use all the technology elements, the options to look at how it's going to change. The biggest impact of the pandemic and others is the growing access to the internet. And we see that in so many things. And we're seeing with the movement in how people work and increasingly work at home, where they can be anywhere to work remotely, that is resulting in a new way of look at distributed learning, distributed living, and changes the paradigms of a brick and mortar school. And the other big thing is we're seeing new emphasis on heavy involvements artificial intelligence, both for the good and bad. Chat GPT is a great thing for education. It's also the bad side, because is it the student's work or is it AI doing the work? And we're seeing a lot more emphasis on gamification and social emotional learning. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing there. And we know that a lot more will be coming, but I think that's a pretty good place to stop right now.
Thank you, Professor Rob.
Well, let's talk about what we could do with education. One of the issues we've got right now is the teachers are spread thinly and and under resourced, and that means even using existing tools, they are unable to perform their function adequately, and the tools that they've got are antiquated for the most part. Some were updated during the pandemic so that students could study and work from home. But what we discovered for the schools that weren't prepared for this is that basically kids lost whatever time that they were at home from education. They didn't progress. The distractions that they had, the inability to multitask, even though they thought they could, or they might have a video game on one screen or one part of their screen and the lesson on the other, or the lesson was behind the video game or whatever else they were doing. It was clear that for the most part, and with exceptions, that working from home didn't work, and that's concerning, because we do have the tools to engage the students. But when you're dealing with remote learning, those tools need to be modified so that the student wants to go through the material. And part of our issue is we tend to treat students as if they're all the same, and they're not. Some students, when they've got severe learning disabilities, we'll often put them in separate classes for learning disabilities, but that can be problematic as well. The testing that went on in the United States, where they took 3 classes, one class as the null set, where they tell the teacher anything, one class where they told the teacher the students were geniuses, and one class where they told the teacher that the students were morons. And the students were all the same. I mean, they were generic. In other words, students were randomly selected. There was no material difference between the students. And as you could imagine, the students where the teacher was told that they were geniuses performed far better than the students where the teacher was told that they're morons. And so the part of the issue when you separate students and put them in different classes is that, again, you lose the fact that the students aren't stupid. They just have some difficulty with regard to some types of learning. But if the teacher thinks they're stupid and naturally stupid, then invariably they'll reinforce some of the negative stereotypes, and the students that are already somewhat disabled will underperform where they otherwise might. And so our capability now is to assess the students early on, reassess the students, and design curricula that best matches the individual's best method of learning. And that probably means not a whole lot of books, because books are static, and certainly moving to more of an online curricula and using something like generative AI, the chat GPT stuff that David spoke about earlier, to refine the curriculum and modify it so it optimizes how the student would best learn, how the student themselves is wired. And we'll probably find that there's a lot of gamification placed in the methodology to keep the student engaged, depending on what the student's attention span and interest in the subject is. And I do think part of our problem is the fact we don't really spend a great deal of time getting the student interested in the subject. We just dictate the student, especially in early years, dictate what the student must learn. And so we don't give them interest. We just dictate what it is they want to do, and then we're surprised they don't learn it, and we're surprised that they cheat. David mentioned that there's a positive and negative to generative AI, and there is. You can use it. You can use it so the AI does the work, and the work it does is mediocre at best. Or you can use it to modify the work that's been done and make it better. Currently the argument is if you're mediocre and you pass responsibility to generative AI, you will remain mediocre, and so will the work. But if you're good and use generative AI, you will become better. The generative AI will correct the mistakes that you've made, make suggestions about how you might be able to tell your story or finish the paper better, and point out things that you may have missed and may not have thought of. And through that process, you not only learn, but you improve the work that you're doing. And that way, when students come out of the education process, they know how to use the tool as the tool should be used, as a way to enhance their capabilities, not as tools and not as a replacement for them, which would be problematic for them in the workforce. Because if they're using it to replace them, then why are they needed to begin with? If all it takes is to tell the generative AI to do a job, well, the person they're working for can do that. They would not be needed. So training students even accidentally to make themselves obsolescent would seem to be a dead end for those students. And yet that's likely what we're going to be doing in the near term is students are going to be using the tool more to cheat and less to enhance themselves, because the education institutions, to a large extent, are looking at the tool like it's a methodology for cheating, and not looking at it as a way to enhance learning and advance the student and carry them forward. It's an abuse of the tool by both the education system and the students themselves, which won't end well. So in the end, this requires a focus on really getting to understand the students early on at a granular level, and then allowing technology to wrap them with the customized curriculum that will best optimize not only how they learn, but who they become. Because we're not the same. We all like different things. Just because all your friends want to be a fireman doesn't mean that you're going to be a good fireman, or your parents were lawyers doesn't mean you're going to be a good lawyer. And certainly in some regions that would apply to doctors as well, where if you don't become a doctor, you don't really account to anything. But what if you don't want to be a doctor? What if you're not even interested? What blood bothers you? You're just not going to be good at that job. So finding something that you would be naturally good at and enjoy are the two things that need to be done fairly early on, so that the curriculum can be adjusted to take the student forward. And so when they come out the back end, they are their own best selves. Now, the other thing the curriculum does a really poor job of doing right now is teaching life skills. When you move away from home, there are a number of things that every student needs to know. They need to know how to protect themselves against fraud. They need to know how to cook their food. They need to know how to clean, put their clothes away, and kind of live a life where they're not always having to go back home and get their parents' help. And so in one way, we complain about the fact that when kids come out of college, they move back home. Yet we're not really assuring that they'll stay out on their own when they move out. We don't give them the financial skills to budget. Unless it's by accident, we don't give them the culinary skills to cook their own food, and we really don't teach them relationships. I mean, a lot of the time the kids get in trouble, both men and women, they get in trouble is because nobody taught them how to protect themselves in a relationship, how to know the troubles they can get in a relationship, and just how to pick somebody they want to be with that will build them up and not tear them down. And in the end, those kinds of things will help define their lives. In fact, we don't even teach them how to have kids, which is just bizarre to me as a culture, that we don't have a curriculum requirement that teaches you how to take care of children. We often somebody gets pregnant, here you got a baby, they have some parental help at the front end, and then they're on their own, and we wonder how mothers and fathers have huge depressions and why we have child abuse. Well, it's because we really don't train kids to not do this, to find another way. And children that come out of broken marriages and abusive marriages often carry that abuse onto their children without society really doing much to stop that. And those things really need to be addressed. We need to be more focused on creating a holistic human, a person that when they come out of education is ready for the world, is excited about what it is they're going to experience, is on a path that will better assure their success, either single, married, or whatever, and knows how to live a qualitative life. And that's where I think the future will eventually go. That's certainly my hope. We have the school skills and tools to do it. We're just not applying them properly. One final comment. There was one program I'm aware of that tended to step up and provide students with the kinds of things they needed when learning remotely, and that was Land School. It was designed from the ground up to teach kids, mostly kids that were disabled or had some other health problem that prevented them from going into school early on. And it was that curriculum or that methodology that worked when kids went remote, because it was designed to work when kids were remote. And they had years, well, decades of refining the tools. They didn't have to start from scratch when the pandemic hit. And learning from organizations like that, when you're trying to do a work from home or school from home program, is critical to making it successful, because they've all got all those practices behind them. They've got all that learning that can be applied, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel and try to do it from scratch. And yet we still continue to do that. So my hope for the future is we'll fix this stuff, and the end will be turning out kids that are far more prepared for the future than they now are.
Thank you, Mr. Markley. What you want to discuss about futuristic educations and?
Well, the future of education is definitely going in a different direction. I was hearing what Rob was saying, and definitely is some interesting things that are going on. I've actually been involved in the testing field for a number of years, and I do know that some of the testing companies here are definitely using the various forms of AI, even in the way that they are getting the kids the responses, and also letting the kids return the responses to the various folks that are doing the scoring. And the company I work for is only one of the several. There are definitely companies like Pearson and Measurement and a number of others that do that work in the education space. And sometimes what definitely Rob was alluding to, and I imagine David was alluding to it as well, is an issue. And I'd love to hear from some of my fellow panelists what their thoughts are, because one of the things that I'm hearing about AI and even some of the things that are going on in the modern day of doing education is that there are biases that are in there that are not always able to be rooted out, because unfortunately the mind of the programmer is also in play as well. So I do know that there have been conversations about racial bias that can exist. I just was talking on the news show on Pod TV earlier today about how a chat GPT was asked a specific question about technology and engineering and things of that nature. And the way that the question was phrased, they basically came back with the answer of white man only, which is not the answer that folks in the African-American community and the other communities want to hear. But I know that if you frame the question a certain way, that may be the answer that you get, and that will discourage some folks that need to be in that space. And we also know that there are some folks of other ethnic groups that are very strong in engineering. So I don't know that the Indians would be feeling all that good about that answer either, because there are definitely some strong folks in that space, and we definitely need to be encouraging our African-American women and men to go into coding. And I do know that there are programs like Black Girls Code that is a national organization and maybe even an international organization that is trying to get more African-American women into the coding space, because there is a shortage in that kind of way. And if I can add to what I'm saying, the other thing that I would bring up is that if we look at the chat bots, even if we look at the names of some of them, they are oftentimes female oriented and in that space. So there might be some gender bias. And I've heard some people even complaining that sometimes those voices sound as if they are being submissive and kind of the attitudes that women don't always want to be encouraged to be. And that's been heard of Alexa. That's been heard of some of the other bots that are out there, including the chat bots, because a lot of times when you look at the chat bots, the majority of them are women and all in that space. And that can even make an interesting dilemma, because when you're an avatar, you can choose what avatar you want to be. And I was actually just in a room recently where the person said that they like the comforting voice of a lady and all in that space, and I can definitely understand that. But sometimes you might want to hear a different tone of voice as well, depending on what the topic is and all in that space, or maybe they can even be gender neutral and all in that kind of space. But that is becoming some of the issues that folks are thinking about, is how we can get all of this great technology, but at the same time try to do something that we as humans have not been good at anyway, which is trying to make sure that we are being a world of unity and a world of betterness and all in that space. And yeah, no, I just made up a word, but that's okay. That can happen every once in a while. But definitely, I was just wondering my fellow panelists' thoughts around some of those issues, because those are issues I've heard even with Chat GPT. And I want to say BART, which is a competitor from Google, and their answers were so bad that their stock actually suffered a fall recently because some of the answers were way out of line in the sense of reality. But I was just wondering whether Rob had heard that, or David, or any of their thoughts about some of the technology and how we can make sure that it is improved. And last but not least, I've heard some people being very concerned about the nature of the AI and what is going on. Because I think I heard a statistic recently that in 5 to 10 years, 90% of what we see on the internet would have been computer generated. And there are some people that are also wondering about even the nature of the workforce. Will we go eventually to our neighborhood restaurant or our neighborhood convenience store and see a bunch of robots running around, and then wonder where the human interaction is? And I do know that I am a supporter of human interaction and the nature of humanity, but some folks might be glad to have the robots do all the work, and then we can all go off to a cruise somewhere. But I don't know what Rob's thoughts are about this and some of the other things that I have brought up to the panel. Rob?
So I guess I'll answer the question. What we had was kind of interesting, that this generative AI war between Microsoft and Google, and the reason that Google's underperforming is they were caught napping. This is a recurrence of the same thing that occurred when Netscape came to market with Microsoft, where Netscape showed up with a browser. Microsoft was caught napping. They ran out and bought Spyglass really quickly. Spyglass kind of sucked, but it was better than nothing. And then they refined it over time, and eventually they took over dominance in browsers, and Netscape went out of business. Now, Microsoft isn't Netscape, and Google isn't Microsoft. But what happened with them is Microsoft put Chat GPT into search. Google was caught napping. They got some warning because they were able to spin over and buy another company's product, slam it into their search engine, and as you pointed out, it didn't end. The amount of research and work that had gone in over years at Microsoft couldn't be done in months or weeks at Google, especially when they were going through downsizing and a bunch of other things that they were dealing with at the time. So in the end, that's kind of why it blew up. Is that's what happened. What was your other question?
The accuracy amount, because I do know there have been some conversations around gender bias and race bias within some of these things, and also just accuracy in general. Because I know Chat GPT has been fairly accurate, but there have been others that have not been as accurate. So that was
and Chat GPT 3 versus 4. The 3 used I think it was like 10,000 10 trillion data elements. The 4 uses 100 quadrillion data elements, so 5 magnitudes more. So it got a lot better in the version that Microsoft implemented, and ChatGPT 5 will have a similar advancement in capability. So it's arguably the most capable of the products in the market. It is interesting, though. It goes back to my time in manpower management, where when we when we try to pick out an engineer, the tools would almost invariably pick out a white guy, and the government said, "Well, that's discriminatory. It's bad." Well, it wasn't the tool's fault. The problem was education was turning out primarily white engineers. The black candidates didn't have engineering backgrounds because they never got it in school. So it wasn't the tool wasn't doing its job. It's that the candidates that were being fed into the tool were predominantly white, and so it was concluding that the candidates to be selected were predominantly white. It wasn't so much a corruption of the database. It was a corruption of the population that was happening in school. And what should have happened is programs that provided incentives to get more people of color and more minorities, including women, which were fast becoming a non-minority, into STEM courses, so that they would come out with engineering degrees. And yet that was not what was done with the EOC. EOC tried to provide a Band-Aid on top, and so they got rid of all these tools that were supposed to help people find their best job and advancement. Did it all change it from objective to subjective, and didn't fix the underlying problem, which was education, so that the mix in education matched the mix of the population, which then would have rolled through and fixed the overall problem. In fact, ironically, because we made it subjective and took away the objective nature, when we started to fix education, the biases remained, because the past behavior was we were putting a bunch of people that weren't educated and forcing them into the jobs they weren't trained to doing, and then they would fail. So industry was pushing back on diversity because it didn't work, because these minorities clearly weren't smart enough to do the job, and they weren't smart enough to do the job because they weren't getting the education they needed. But the conclusions that were made was somehow related genetically to who they were, and not a failure of education. So it was just a complete cluster, and so making sure that doesn't recur would be an excellent step, because we need diversity that matches the population. When you don't match a population's diversity, you're going to have upswings in crime. You're going to have groups of people that are very dissatisfied, and rightly so, for how they're being treated. And instead of taking the best and brightest, you're taking a lot of the best and brightest, and you're kind of assuring you're not going to be the best and brightest, which makes no sense whatsoever. Especially when you're building commercial products, you're going to build products that won't match or won't meet the needs of a good chunk of the population, because the people designing them don't match that chunk of the population. It is stupid at every level. So hopefully we're going to eventually fix this, but we've actually made the problem worse by not focusing more heavily on assuring the objective tools are providing the outcomes we want, and continuing to drop back into subjective mechanisms, and subjective mechanisms are highly biased, and fixing subjective bias is far harder than fixing objective bias.
No, that makes sense. And the last thing I was curious about, and I think I had asked it earlier in those three questions, was are we running the risk? Because I've heard people literally say that they are looking forward to it, and other people are richly concerned. I know that even in the measurement company that I was talking about, which is a student company, there was a time that we were tested against AI. I actually think that we did as well as AI, which is why we are still having some of our jobs in order to grade the papers, because sometimes there are nuances that the AI doesn't always catch, but eventually those nuances may be able to be caught by AI even better, and then our jobs might be even more in jeopardy. But right now it is not as much in jeopardy, because I want to say it was either last year or the year before they had us going up against the AI. I don't even know that we knew we were going up against the AI until after the fact and everything. But like I said, there were some nuances that we were able to pick up on based on our own life experiences and our own humanity that the computer could not necessarily pick up. But I do know that there are folks, particularly in the service industry, like I mentioned the restaurant workers and some of the others, that are like, wait a minute, does this mean that I'm going to be out of a job in a while? And does this mean that there won't be as many restaurant workers because there'll be little robots running around picking your order and all in that space?
There are already not enough restaurant workers. I mean, one of the interesting things driving robotics and automation into restaurants right now is the restaurants can't get people. The irony here is that restaurants were fairly far down the hierarchy of automation, because labor was cheap, right. And you couldn't justify automating them because the automation cost more than labor did. Right. And then we had the pandemic, and suddenly people didn't want any of these jobs, and so we had restaurants that were having to open for reduced hours or had to close because they couldn't get staffing. I mean, where I live here, a good chunk of the restaurants just went out of business, not because of a lack of business, because of the lack of people, and the fast food restaurants. I mean, the one down the street's now offering $20 an hour, which is pretty decent wage, just to get people in, and they're still understaffed. They still can't get people to do the jobs, and so now we've got a big push to put automation into food services, particularly fast food services. Ironically, and the other thing I found really interesting is that the robots are being used for French fries, because I don't think anybody really knew that French fries were as dangerous. Making French fries was as dangerous as it was, but that's where most of the injuries are, is from making French fries. Everybody's saying, oh yeah, we need burger machines. No, we need French fry machines, because for the workers we have, a lot of them are getting injured because they're getting burned by the French fry machine. Anyway, the end result is, because of the lack of workers, we're automating it. So what predicated the move of automation that eliminates jobs was the lack of people that wanted to do those jobs. And maybe that's the way it should be. If people don't want to do the jobs, then put robots in those jobs. You're taking away jobs that people don't want to do. That's all right. It was like we used to do with illegal labor. The illegal labor on farms was doing jobs that local labor didn't want to do, and so then people were screaming about illegal aliens taking jobs. Yeah, they were taking jobs. We were taking jobs that the local people didn't want to do. So what's the problem? Why is that a problem we need to fix? And we look at farming, and farming is another area that's getting heavily automated at the moment, because we put the farmers between a rock and a hard place. The locals don't want to do the work, and we won't let them import labor across the border. So how do they harvest their crops? How do they plant? How do they weed? So John Deere and other firms have stepped up and said, well, the way you're going to do that is you're going to get robots, because the robots you can get to come to work, and you're not going to have law enforcement show up and drag all your workers away because they can come across the border legally. So in the end, a lot of the automation we're going to see early on is a result of the fact that you couldn't get people to do this, and in some areas like mining, like silo repair, where the death rate is extremely high. Those are areas where robots should be used, and probably should have been used for a long period of time. But again, the cost of labor and dealing with the sickness and death was lower than the cost of automation. So we had people do it, and that I would argue that's a bad. The fact that it's cheaper to allow people to die than use machines is probably a statement of government really not doing their job. But in the end, it looks like in a lot of areas where automation is going in, it's in areas where people just were not happy. At least initially.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, I think you have a presentation.
Well, Sharif, I pulled up just one slide to use. And this is out of a scenario study that was done on the future of education. And this group surveyed principals, teachers, professors, and I think it was 25 different countries. And these were the 4 scenarios that came out of it. One of them was that the schooling as we know it continues, that former education has a continuing a place to be, and that not much would change. I think we see with COVID and the pandemics and others that one is one of the more or less likely scenarios that came out of this study. But and that one, the international collaboration and the advances like we've talked about in the technology, in the use of artificial intelligence, the use of virtual reality, augmented reality, and the growth of the metaverse and other things in education really allow to support more individualized learning. But the structure and process of schooling would remain. I know particularly when I look in the technology fields with developers and others like that, we're seeing that process is being disrupted tremendously today. But that is one scenario. A second scenario was that education is outsourced, and that traditional school systems break down as more parents, as others become involved in educating their kids, the communities and their citizens. And I can tell you in my community here in Austin, we're seeing that trend accelerate quite a bit. Our enrollment in our public schools is down considerably. We have charter schools. We have private schools, we have homeschool, group schools, we have homeschooling. We see the growth of directed community-based learning tremendously extending. And as we go into the higher, the use of boot camps and others has been expanding. But that's kind of what this one is that learning takes place through the really more diverse opportunities like we just talked about. You're seeing very flexible agreements where you can study half a day, go do other things half a day, where there's learning on demand. Um, and you see things like Khan Academy and others further expanding to support this type of scenario. The third one is kind of interesting, that schools remain, but they have become learning hubs. They've become a way to be connected in the community, but they support the concept called open school walls, where you can do a lot of things that are in the second scenario, but they are connected to their communities, which include things like social innovation, involving very heavily with engagement with the different things in the community and ever-changing forms of learning. The fourth one is learn as you go, where education takes place everywhere, anytime. And the distinctions between what is a formal education, an informal education, and training are no longer valid as society, in this scenario, says turns itself entirely to the power of the machine. Now, is any one of these four scenarios they came up with the ultimate scenario? No. But I think you will see a hybrid, particularly of 2, 3, and 4. I think the first scenario is the least likely scenario to continue much into the future. But I see elements of 2, 3, and 4 really being where the future of education is headed. I say this is I thought, a very good set of scenarios to begin to look at where we have that. This does not directly address things like the artificial intelligence that we've been talking about. It does not address elements of the metaverse. It doesn't address many of those. But it's a very good baseline for it, because if you go back and look at some market numbers for this, the global online education market in 2021 was $320 billion. And because of the pandemic and things, that is now growing at a fairly enhanced compound annual growth rate. Before the pandemic, it was growing at about 9%. After the pandemic, that is growing at a little bit over 40% compound annual growth. So you can see that it's going, and that the digital forms of education are really accelerating now, as well as the privatization of education. And, we saw the distance learning going. According to a study by Forbes, that open distance education universities in Bangladesh, India, Iran, Pakistan, South Africa, currently enroll more than 7 million students combined. So you're seeing this type of growth really heading forward. The other big trend that these scenarios do not directly cover is the concept of what is called a massive open online course, or an MOOC, which are in many ways projected to supplement a whole lot of the traditional distance learning technology. And as was talking about, particularly earlier by Mark, there are challenges with the digital divide. And there are places where it's there, where there's going to be challenges with the biases that are in the artificial intelligence systems. There's going to be challenges even with taking the traditional education and making it digital with your master teachers, because they do not represent the nuances of it. You know, you see that the other big trend that's going to be really interesting is between 2020 and 2050. The projection is that the number of people without any type of formal education will decline to about 5% of the global population. So that is a very good output as we look at the future of education and what is being done there. But there's just so many and others that I thought those four scenarios would provide your audience with a good look at some of what the thought is in the education community, Sharif.
Thank you, Mr. Martley.
No, definitely some valid points being brought, and definitely I know a lot of folks are looking at these different ways of making sure that AI is being fair and all in that kind of space. I'm just glad that that is being considered, and definitely the whole global education. And I do agree with something that David said, which is that the notion of how education will be done is changing as well. Because I do know a lot of people are looking at hybrid models of education. We saw that during the pandemic, and I don't think that we're going to be able to get out of it and all in that space. I know, just like we were talking about people wanting to go back to their jobs, a lot of people want to go back to their schools, and a lot of people are glad that the students are back in their schoolrooms, complete with the buses and all in that space. Unfortunately, when they come back, there can also be the bad element of socialization as well. Because I know here in Durham, we actually had one of our schools on lockdown because unfortunately, sometimes the gang mentality can also come in when you're in those live environments as well. So that is probably going to encourage even more people to want to go into the hybrid model and things in that space, because that is something that I know a lot of people were not prepared for when we went into the pandemic. But now that we are back out, a lot of the kids are back in school. A lot of them are not necessarily wearing the mask, because apparently we're slowly but surely getting out of this pandemic, even though I understand that there might be new ones on the forefront, including a new nanovirus that is out there from what I am hearing, and all in that kind of space. But definitely, I think that the hybrid model is going to be the model. We saw it in the college level, and I think we're going to see it in other levels as well. But I don't know if Rob's got any thoughts around that, or even David, because I do know that a lot of times we were forced into hybrid. And as you alluded to, Rob, a lot of the workers didn't want to go back. And I'm not sure that a lot of the students wanted to go back either. So I'm thinking that they would be more than pleased if they had instead of a 5-day school week, a work week that was maybe 3 and 2 or something like that. I do know that a lot of students do like to be socialized with their friends, but there might be ways that can happen in the modern world that we are headed into. Maybe they only go in on Thursday and Friday when the athletics are going on and the drama clubs are going on, but that's just a quick theory, and I don't know that that's going to be a realistic theory. But Rob, you're over there in California, which is in the forefront of a lot of these things, but do you have any thoughts on that, or even David as well? Because I don't know that we're going to have the little red schoolhouse and the old way of doing things totally the way that we have historically way back when. But I think that we're heading toward a new model of education. I think that's what David was alluding to, but I don't know other people's thoughts around that.
Well, yeah, I think you make an interesting point.
Thank
the
you, Dr.
social
Talim.
aspect.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. That the problems with remote education were also the fact that the kids were not socialized, and and that became problematic as they went back to school, because we've had a huge number of problems. Actually, I'm in Oregon now, not California. But yeah, we just had a school shut down here, full lockdown, because of a bomb threat or whatever, and nothing happened. But we've had issues. I think most areas have. The kids just haven't been properly socialized, and that's been a problem with remote for some time. And now, and one of the things we don't talk about with regard to education is a lot of parents use schools like babysitters.
Yep.
They're off at work, the kids are at home. Well, what do you do if the kids are at home and the parents are still off at work? I mean, it made sense when the parents were working from home too, sort of. But now you're all fighting for resources that were never set up to have an office at home where you've got multiple people using the internet all at the same time and all in the same contained area. So everybody starts irritating the hell out of each other. And so the parents really want the kids to go away, even if they're working from home. so they can have some peace and quiet and get their own projects done. And if they're at work, then you've got kids that are too young to be home alone with full access to the internet. You're kind of surprised we didn't have more houses burned down. We did have a few. The kids get in trouble when they don't have oversight.
Rob, along the same lines, and I can't resist teasing and everything, but let's be realistic. Tuesday is around the corner. Valentine's Day is around the corner. I'm the old single person here and everything, but there were also some parents that wanted the kids away so that they could have some me time with their other half and everything.
We'll call it me time. But that's what it is. It was their peace and quiet. If you've got 3 or 4 kids and the kids are home all the time, the mother's going to be, assuming the mother's home, if the father's home and you've got single parents. I mean, think of the single parent. What do they do? They're off working the schools. They're free babysitter. Now they no longer have a free babysitter. Typically, people live paycheck to paycheck. Where does the money come for somebody to watch the kids? So it really created a fairly significant problem that we weren't as a society set up for. We'd gone from the nuclear family where the husband worked and the wife stayed at home. But even when in that nuclear family, the kids went off to school, that for the most part, the wife, at least when she was home, she had some quiet time. And when the kids are home, she didn't. But now we no longer have a nuclear family. Now often both parents work. And what the heck do you do with the kids? And what we found is that part of it broke down really badly. And we do not have a great fix for that. Dr. Talib.
Dr. Talib Rafal.
Hi. I'm sorry I'm late. I had problems with connections as always. I'm sorry. Okay. I'd rather not speak now. I'd like to hear what David had to say. I heard what Rob had to say, Mark Lee had to say. But I'd rather listen to what they have to say first. Thank you.
Well, Chief, let me jump in with one thing to tack on to what Rob said. One of the biggest failures during the pandemic and during the shift is the concept of social emotional learning. It hit school kids in the education thing. It actually hit office workers too, because the norms for the social emotional learning in the offices were tremendously disrupted. It actually had impacts even in the senior citizens community, where the social distancing and things prevented the older citizens from going out and doing social things for their social and emotional learning. And so whatever system that comes out of this education, and which any of those scenarios on the 2, 3, 4 of the chart that was up earlier is used, need to take into account those soft sides, the social emotional learning. It has to take into account the diversity that's required among the different cultural groups. It has to take into account the digital divide. It has to really also take into account that there are multiple streams now today of educational opportunities outside of a formal education that need to be embraced in that. You've heard me talk in the past quite a bit that we're in a time of lifelong learning. Well, any scenario for the future of education really has to take into account that need for lifelong learning, that we're going to have more and more careers than we did at any time in the past history, and that the education systems must fully embrace that. And as Rob has said, as I have said, as Mark has said, it needs to be looking at the future of the personalization. We have the technology to help support how to personalize learning more, particularly for those students who learn different ways, for those students who have special needs, for the ones where, like Rob was talking about, there is not as much parental support at home, particularly when you look at distance learning that was impacted so heavily during the pandemic, where kids lost whole years of education because of them being at home alone, oftentimes trying to do education. So I think those are some of the trends that we really have to understand here. I'm going to go back to one other last one, though, is that as we go and do more and more digital education in of these different forms, we have to take into account some things like in the United States, there's a law called Protection of the Minor Act, which takes and extends privacy protection and cybersecurity across the minors as well. So all those things have to be considered when we're looking at the future of education.
Thank you. Mr. Professor Talib, we are looking for concluding remarks
Okay.
for today's
What I
session.
want to say, is a bit different from that. We have witnessed a revolution in education after the spread of the internet, because people cannot keep learning the way they do before. Now with the internet, you can get all the information you want. I remember when I was in school, I used to not have even the calculator. I used to calculate things myself. Now, of course, this is not the case. So what I want to say now, with artificial intelligence particularly, I think education has to change also. They have to change in a dramatic way, because it's not going to work like that. It's not going to work the traditional way. Education has to be different. People don't have to memorize things at all. They have to think for themselves. And probably now the new educational systems will have to do more training while education. In other words, they may have to go to school for less time and go to work for more time while they're studying. I think that's one of the outcomes of this new generation of technology. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Markleaf, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, I think we've had a great conference and a great conversation here. Definitely, I think that it gives a lot of people insights onto the new direction of education, as well as how AI and other things are playing into it. And like I've said a couple of times on here, as long as we are doing this in a way that is going to be sustainable, but also able to be reflective of what our entire society is, and making sure that all of the people that are involved in this development are reached fairly and are able to enjoy this great AI and all in that space. The one thing that I would hate to see happen, and I don't think that anybody on this panel I know would want it to happen, but we also know the realities of government and the reality of life and everything is a dystopian environment where all the AI is going to the elite, and those that are in the poor classes and all of the other spaces are being left in the woods. We talked about that digital divide, and I'd hate to see the digital divide grow into an AI divide or any other kind of divide as well. So that would be my concern, that as we continue this development, that we make sure that all the aspects of society, be that folks like you that are in Malaysia, or that be folks that are in rural Appalachia, North Carolina, or be that folks that are in the urban cities of Chicago and New York, are able to get some of the benefits as well.
Thank you. Professor Rob, what's your concluding remarks?
At some point in time, education went from preparing kids to be adults to getting them through the curriculum. That was the fundamental mistake that I think education made in the past. If we go back to before the Industrial Revolution, kids were trained by their parents, and they often went into the jobs that the parents did. The parents were tasked with turning their children into productive adults, and those parents tended to teach them everything they needed to do so. That if they needed to hunt, they taught them hunting. They needed to chop wood, they taught them how to chop wood. Needed to cook, the kids were taught how to cook. In fact, they had to help around the kitchen. You had a mechanism that assured that while the kids might end up in a career that might not be optimal for them, at least they had the core skills they needed to have a life. We stopped doing that when we formalized education. We focused on book learning and teaching many from one. So that the idea of making it as easy as possible for the teacher to teach students a bunch of stuff, and we lost the coupling between the stuff and having a successful life. And as a result, when kids come out of education, they are ill prepared for relationships, ill prepared to live on their own. They are increasingly depressed. and unhappy about the world they find themselves in, because that world is very different. Instead of having parents taking care of all their needs, they have to take care of those needs themselves, and we didn't prepare them for that either. So what education has to do is find a way to return the granularity and focus to the process, so that we are again turning out kids that are whole, that have the capabilities they need to have a complete life. And we can use technology to fix the one problem that we didn't fix before the Industrial Revolution, is we can help them find a career path that will be the best for them, the best for their values, for the best for the way they think. We can do that. And what technology can do is can return that granularity. We can give them a curriculum that is custom designed for them and looks at where the gaps are, does gap analysis, and provides the education that they otherwise would miss. We can do a better job. We've got the technology. The problem we're going to have is we have a lot of decades, of centuries of bad practices in education that we have to overcome to get there. And we're treating some of the most advanced tools to fix the problem as if there's some criminal endeavor. Talking about generative AI only as a way to cheat is problematic, because it is one of the tools that fundamentally could fix this problem and provide the granularity I'm talking about. So our goal has to be to once again focus on what we should have always focused on, and that's creating kids that are fully prepared to be adults, and then using the AI tools to assure that outcome. If we don't do that, I'm afraid AI will be abused, as it currently is being abused, and the result will be suboptimal.
Thank you, Professor David Smith.
I agree with everything that's been said here today, in that today has been a really good session. The one solid outcome we see from this is that the future of education is changing. It's going to be very different than education was a decade ago. And I don't think, as we've said, there's any going back to what education was before. The same as I look at training, you're going to see training continue to go forward and will not be going back. And I think that's a good result. We do know that the world is becoming more and more digital. We do know that connectivity is dramatically increasing around the world. We also know that education can become more personalized as we look through the elements of that. We also seen that we have curriculum that dramatically needs technology to engage the student. If I take and extend these scenarios out by 2050, it's just a pinch point. Many students around the world will no longer have to physically go to schools instead to get an education, and you'll see that. For many students, this will represent a brighter future for themselves. For others, that really depend on hands-on learning and working with others, that's going to be a change. But the transformation of education in the coming decades is really a chance to have us look at it and structure a better outcome, a better way to inspire future leaders, a better way to meet the needs of what we have. Now, I'm going to go back, and I've said often that education hasn't changed much since the time of Socrates. But Socrates had a statement on education that I thought was very profound. And it was, education is the kindling of a flame. It's not the filling of the vessel. And if you think about that, that fits so true today. If we truly are in a time of lifelong learning, education is the flame that we need to accomplish that lifelong learning, because the content, the filling of the vessel with the educational knowledge is continually going to change during all of our lifetimes. And that's how our education system must shift to better meet that need of lifelong learning. So Dr. Sharif, thank you for letting me be part of this.
Thank you, Dr. Talib. What's your concluding remarks?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I listened very carefully to what David and Rob said. I wasn't aware of what Rob said, but I'm thinking about it now. Rob said that before the Industrial Revolution, we had education different from what we have it now. We certainly did. Now, this is a new era we're going into. This era is going to be one of education by distance, definitely. And, COVID had taught us that online learning is an option, is a very serious option. But that needs different type of teachers. Teachers are not trained to do that. Not students, but teachers. Now, what's going to happen now with artificial intelligence? It's something else. I think artificial intelligence need to have the system of education be thought of from the start to the end. Both the students and the teachers have to change. Our education institutions have to change, definitely. And what I'm suggesting is very simple. I think what will happen is there will be more training, there will be more on the job, because what you need to do is lessen the vacuum between the output of education and the real job needs. That vacuum, that distance is very going wider and wider as we go along. So I think that's what will need to happen. And you don't need to spend 4 years to get a degree anymore. I think that's something that you need to rethink all over again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. This is an excellent session, especially when we discuss about futuristic educations. So hopefully through this process, our audience can learn many different things. Thank you, Dr. Talib Rafael, Mr. Markley, Mr. Rob, and Mr. David Smith for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.